Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I thought I would come out and talk a little bit more about the central bank's balance sheet, right? I know a lot of people are still confused about what's going on with the Federal Reserve, their balance sheet, the unwinding of the balance sheet. A lot of people still think that the Federal Reserve is in a quantitative easing program right now. This is what's going on with the Federal Reserve. I'm going to try and break it down in layman's terms for you real quick. The Federal Reserve has a balance sheet. On their balance sheet is assets and liabilities. Their assets are like treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, right? The mortgage-backed securities are like everybody's home loans all jumbled together inside of a contract, okay? They buy these contracts. When those contracts get paid off, they get their liabilities back, which is basically the money that's out there in the system, the Federal Reserve notes and these bank deposits and stuff like that. So assets, liabilities, okay? During the quantitative easing program, they printed up a bunch of liabilities and bought a bunch of assets with them. Now, probably about a year and a half ago or so, they started allowing those treasuries, those mortgage-backed securities, their assets, they allowed them to mature and unwind, right? So instead of taking the maturity, the money that they got back from the treasury, and instead of rolling that over and into a new bond, they would take the money out of the system, okay? This would start decreasing the amount of liabilities as well as the assets that were on their balance sheet, okay? So this is the unwinding of their balance sheet that's taking place right now. So how does this affect the big banks, right? So the big banks, typically, what they use is something called a corridor system in order to establish interest rates, okay? So the Federal Reserve would buy and sell treasuries from the big banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. And they would buy and sell these treasuries off of their balance sheets, right? Their individual ones. And the banks at the end of the day who had excess reserves would loan those over to the banks who needed reserves at the end of the day, so that every morning, the next morning, they would all be basically whole again, ready to do business. So that's how the corridor system worked. There was scarcity, right? Some of them had money, some of them didn't. The ones who didn't borrowed it from the ones who did, and they would have to figure out what interest rate that was. That interest rate was the effective fund rate. The fund rate was what the Fed was shooting for by buying and selling treasuries off of those banks to try and get to this effective fund rate, okay? What we've been working in now is an abundant reserve system. So the Federal Reserve filled up all these banks. Their reserves were filled. They didn't need to borrow from anybody. But now they have excess reserves, and what do they do with it? And that's where the Federal Reserve had their overnight reverse repo rate. Okay, so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but before they used to use a corridor system where it worked off of scarcity. Now they have an abundant reserve system where they deal with the Federal Reserve directly on how to establish these interest rates, right? Because they take their excess reserves, they go over to there, they have an interest rate that's established with them. This is like the floor. Like they wouldn't loan any less than the Federal Reserve would be willing to pay, right? Does that make sense? Because if the Federal Reserve's at 2.5, they wouldn't go to somebody else and loan it at 2.25. That doesn't make any sense, right? So this is where the floor system came in. Now, what the Federal Reserve has done is now they're letting these assets roll off of this balance sheet, okay? And they're going to sit there and they're going to wait until September. Now, I believe right now they're allowing like $50 billion worth to roll off every month. Come May, they're going to allow it, they're going to start decreasing it. I guess it's going down to like $30 billion or something. And then come September, they're going to stop it altogether. There'll be no more unwinding of the balance sheet, okay? It's at that point that they're going to sit there and wait for the reserves at these banks to diminish, okay? Once they get to a point that these banks are like, okay, I don't have excess reserves anymore, I'm in need of reserves again, so basically establishing a corridor system, the Federal Reserve at that point will start stepping in and buying treasuries again, okay? So what you're going to see is the Federal Reserve, who is allowing treasuries to unwind and come off their balance sheet, bringing in their liabilities, end that. Okay, and they're going to sit there and they're just going to wait. And as the big banks' reserves diminish to a point that they say, okay, I don't have the excess reserves like I used to. Now I need to borrow some money and overnight to make myself whole for the next morning. The Federal Reserve at that point will be stepping in and buying assets. And it says it right here. After it is normalized size is reached, the portfolio is assumed to incrementally grow again as Treasury securities are purchased to keep pace with the trend growth in liabilities, mainly currency. So what they're saying right there is that by this point, there's going to be a demand for currencies again, not like during recessions when there's less of the demand for them because assets are getting cheaper and cheaper and there's less demand for the money out there. During a growth period, there's going to be a demand for currencies, and that's where they say they're going to start stepping back in and start buying assets again. So if you can imagine like a timeline on this, it's going to be very slow, okay? After September and they sit on their hands waiting for those reserves, that reserve time, like for the banks to get, to drop their reserves down again so where they're going to be in need of reserves, that might take a while. That might take, till 2020, might take till 2025. Who knows how long that part will take? But that's the plan, okay? So they're going to, like I said, what they're going to do is come September, they're going to they're going to stop that unwinding of the balance sheet, and they're just going to sit there and they're going to wait and watch until the big banks are starting to need of reserves again. Once that happens, that's the corridor system, and they're going to start stepping in and buying assets and treasuries, to start building up their balance sheet again. So there's going to be an unwinding of their balance sheet till September, right, where, both liabilities and assets are dropping off the balance sheet. Then it's going to end, it's going to stop right there where you're not going to see this unwinding taking place anymore. And then for a while, until the reserves get down to a point that the bank is going to be needing in reserves again, that's where the Federal Reserve will start stepping back in and buying assets again. That's according to the future of the central bank's balance sheet coming out of the New York Bank dated May 4th, 2018. Uneducated Economist. We'll talk to you later.